can't just keep going, can I? And out the door. And we're going to go a little bit slower now that I've introduced the first 2 sessions, and we have 3 more, and I finally figured out I was supposed to teach this week. It's next week that Kevin will be coming, and he will be in a hazmat suit, but even so, he won't be in a hazmat suit, will he? No, okay. This is something actually that we know from 1 John, but also think back to our gospel meeting with Scott Young, because he spent quite a bit of time on this. He talked about the Gnostics. Do you happen to remember those people? And we have that section where it says that sin is trespassing, that is going beyond God's law. And that's a good definition. But remember the context that that's given in. That he's talking to a group of people who don't feel, remember the Gnostics, they don't feel like they're capable of sinning. They don't really recognize sin. And so he says, I don't have to follow laws. So therefore, let me tell you that here is what sin is. It's when you trespass or it's when you go beyond God's law. That's just part of the elephant, though, if you remember our first lesson. It's accurate, it's truthful, but as I mentioned to you before, if we look at the Hebrew word, meaning transgressing or breaking God's law, that the Greek word means missing the mark. And I don't know if you've heard sermons where people have illustrated it by talking about the bow and arrow and shooting at the target. And if you miss the target, you're sinning. You're missing the mark. So it's reasonable to say our failure to live up to God's standards is sin. But if we use that as our only conclusion, let's think about this seriously. If we use that as our only conclusion, and if we ignore everything else talking about sin in the Bible, then we can come up with this thought, which is also pretty common. Well, there's missing and then there's missing. There's going 56 miles an hour and there's going 126 miles an hour. One is a serious sin, the other is a little sin. And as I pointed out last week, there's a tendency for these to be overlooked. And in our history, what happens is a serious sin will often over time become a little sin, and then in a different generation, a little sin will become acceptable behavior. And I think we all can think of various things in our lifetimes, no matter how short they are, that's taken place. And if you look at history, it happens in a whole lot. Now, am I saying that sin is not going beyond God's law? Of course it is. I am saying that is true. But I'm saying that's not necessarily the whole thing. I would also argue that sin is a betrayal of God, and that's a definition of sin. Sin is when you betray God. Sin can, I'm going to have to read. I can't do this anymore from memory or even little bits. Have you noticed how much I put on the screen? And that is because I can't stay up with it. And so just bear with me as best I can, because I'm going to jump back and forth, and you get to see the back of my head, which some people say is an improvement, but let's not go there now. Sin can also be defined as a betrayal of the king who deserves the highest honor and allegiance. You see, our sin stains both God's honor and all those associated with him. When we sin, we're staining. Now we're getting into this term honor, and we're going to be talking about honor and shame quite a bit this evening. Honor is something that's defined as integrity in the Bible. It's sometimes called integrity. Sometimes it's called esteem. Sometimes it's called dignity. Sometimes it's called reputation. Now, I've mentioned this before to Richard, but one of the things that I think one group of people that have a particular clear idea of honor and shame are Southerners. And that's not a joke. The idea of honor, it may not be accurate in a biblical sense, but the idea of being an honorable person to many of a certain generation of Southerners means something. It has a particular term in their core. And in some ways, I'm arguing that it's not just people overseas, it's not just Southerners. All of us have this feeling, but we don't often recognize it. Honor is always given by an internal attitude of respect and reverence. And it's also always giving appropriate attention and obeying commands. So there's two parts to honor. There's the inside and there's the outside. Does this sound kind of biblical? It's not just the outside actions, it's what's inside. This is the theme that goes through the Bible, and that's why we're trying to cover it. And it's amazing to me that it's all covered within the first several chapters of Genesis. You see, honor without action doesn't work properly. It's broken. Action without the proper attitude is at most lip service. In Isaiah the 29th chapter, these people, we quote this quite a bit, don't we? Come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught. Now think back to what we have just covered. Think about Adam and Eve and how they acted in the garden. What did they do? They trusted themselves to make decisions as equally wise as those of God's. And then what? That caused each to believe that they could protect themselves, take care of themselves, and be the final judge of their behavior. And I'm arguing that it's not limited to just Adam and Eve. Everyone born in this world, with the exception of Jesus, has shown the same attitude. Each of us has betrayed the Creator when we have believed and acted as if we were able to protect ourselves, take care of ourselves, and be the final judge of our behavior. Think the last time you were upset with someone. You wanted to protect yourself at some level, didn't you? You wanted to take care of yourself. You wanted to be the judge that would take care. When I say judge, that means the final decision maker of what's right and wrong. Not the judges we see in law, where the judge is up there as a referee in a court saying, you're going here, you can't do this, you can't do that. But a judge is talked about in the New Testament when Jesus becomes the judge. It doesn't mean he's deciding at the last second whether you're right or wrong. He's not giving a thumbs up or thumbs down. He is executing judgment. The judge judges, that is, makes the final decision and executes judgment. The decision has already been made as to what we're like. Let's keep on going as we see. I want to show you this and kind of see if it makes sense to you. I'd like to go to 2 Samuel, 12th chapter. If you want to turn there in your Bible, we're going to look at it very quickly, but even so, in case you don't remember, it's the story of the prophet Nathan. He's been told to go to David. I remember classes on commandments where we use this as an example, and people would sometimes say, well, what commandments did David break? And you know, if you start out with 10, there aren't many left when you get through with it in this particular action. He goes through a lot of them here. But here's the point that I'd like you to make, I'd like you to remember when I talk about sin is a betrayal of God. I'll ask you this question. Which commandments did Nathan accuse David of trespassing? Did he say, you broke number 1, you broke number 2, you broke number 3, you broke number 5, you broke number 7, you broke number 9? And the answer is none of them. None of them. No, that's not what I'm getting at, Dave. David did not convict himself. David was in fact accused of something, of sin, but the sin wasn't breaking the commandments. The sin was disloyalty and shaming God. Nowhere in this passage does it mentions what he did, but it doesn't mention the commandments. Remember our first definition, if we use only sin is a transgressing or going beyond the law. I'm having trouble with that today. Going beyond the law, well, that's not mentioned here. Instead, in this passage, why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? You have struck and killed Uriah. He mentions the facts here, and I think this is what you're getting at, Dave, and I didn't mean to snap at you if I did. I'm sorry about that. Okay? The Hittite with the sword, you have taken his wife as your wife, and you have slaughtered him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Now then, the sword shall never leave your house, because what? You have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. However, since by this deed you have shown utter disrespect for the Lord, the child himself who is born to you shall certainly die. Now, without getting into this too deeply, if we want to argue, and we have, about what David should have looked at outside the window or didn't look out inside the window, or who should be naked or who is not naked on top of the rooftop, this is where the sin is. By breaking those commandments, David is being disloyal. He is betraying God. When he despised God, David scorned God's honor. In addition, David despised God's glory by dismissing and disrespecting God's promises made earlier to him. And you can see that in 2 Samuel, the 7th chapter. In verses 7 through 14, it lists the things that this is what David will be given. This is the good things that will happen. Here are your promises, David. At the end of 5 weeks, what I'm hoping is, and I know we have in our mind, we have this idea that sin is bad and sin is terrible and sin is causing me to break fellowship with God. I want you to think of a universe that's black. That's totally black. And there's only one spot of light in it. And that's Jesus Christ. When he was here on earth, that is the one spot of light. He is the only good man by definition. Because the rest of us aren't. Now, he's done other things for us. We'll get to that. But here's the point of where we were before that happened. This whole universe is broken. Everything is twisted and torn. And it's all because of what happens in our minds. The decisions we make. Not the actions. We'll talk about this a little bit later. The actions do, but where does the sin actually begin according to God? In our hearts or minds. We decide it first, and at that moment, that's when sin grows. So, people sin. That refusal to acknowledge God brings shame on him. Have you ever thought of that? Another thing that you're doing is you're bringing shame on God. We understand this when we look at our kids and we tell our kids, don't do anything that will bring shame on the family. But then we kind of forget it when we talk about God and think that it works the same way. Don't bring shame on God. Since man can only reflect God's glory, this is how I look at it and kind of tie this together. When they despise it, that glory, they instead reflect only the resulting shame and disgrace. We're only a mirror. We're only a mirror in the sense that we can either reflect God's glory or we can reflect the shame that we're sending him. So sin both dishonors God and it strips the person of the honor he or she should have before God. Have you told people that you've been made, God has made you, and that's something you should believe in and you should appreciate? That you're something special? Well, that's true. But what does sin do? Sin takes that honor and twists it. In Genesis 3, the sins of Adam and Eve dishonored both God and themselves. This is what I mentioned last week. I just wanted to go over it and see if it makes a little more sense then. They seem to have been aware of something out of order after eating. So what do? Their sense of shame came from their sin. It says that they were ashamed. Because of it, they feel unworthy of honor. God desired that they learn about sin by avoiding it and using their free will to trust Him. Isn't that what He had in mind? Look at the things that you can eat. Don't concentrate on the negative. Instead, they understood the consequences of sin by becoming directly involved in it, and so have we. Then, instead of relying on God, they continued to choose to be guided by their intellect and attempt to solve the problem themselves. Do you remember what they did after they felt ashamed? They made what? The leave clothes. Yeah, I like that. The leaf clothes. English word shame originally means, if you go back to its root, means to hide. This idea of shame. What do little kids do when they're ashamed? When they feel that shame? Do they hide their face? Sometimes. Do they turn into a corner? Sometimes. Do they start covering up parts of their body when they get at a certain age, even though they don't really understand what's going on? Yes, it's built into us. That sense of shame. Even though rejected, and this is what I want to get out of this and the positive thing, even though he was rejected, what does God do? He makes them clothes that's acceptable. And when I say acceptable, that met their need at the time. He showed them how, and he made clothes that were acceptable. Did he have to? They've just dishonored him. They've just shamed him. And so what does God do in his grace? I think we overlook this sometimes. We just kind of pass it by. Well, then he made clothes for him, or we may get into a discussion about skins and killing animals or something like that. But the point is, from the writer, seems to be he made something because he was generous and he was good. He allows them to exist. Sin, then, is a disobedience of God's law. It's also a betrayal of God's connection with man and woman. That unfaithfulness brings dishonor to God. It produces disgrace in those who sin. It's a decision made misusing our free will with every choice. With every choice. He said as he turns the page, I'm sorry. With every choice having consequences that outlive the original moment. Here's what sin does. Sin has even found a way to use those consequences to create more opportunities for sin. Because sin twists shame for its own use. Nothing is written that causes us to doubt either Cain or Abel's sincerity in their worship to God when they're first introduced. Both of them wanted God's approval. There is no evidence that either of them refused to serve God, and both, like their parents, had the gift of free will. In Genesis 4, Cain knowingly did not follow God's instruction, and because of that, his offering was not accepted. However, his brother did as God commanded, and his sacrifice was approved. Hebrews, the 11th chapter and verse 4 says that by faith Abel did what? He offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. Now I know we've had a discussion on that about where that's involved, the sacrifice, etc. All I'm asking you is to think that there is two possibilities here. One, it's the sacrifice there. Number two, it's the intent behind the sacrifice. That's also a better sacrifice. What comes from the mind. And what we're seeing here is from his mind. It's not that Cain made a mistake and that he mistook a plant for an animal. It's in his mind he made this decision to do this. That's where the sin is involved. Because what is faith? It's trust. What did Abel do? He trusted God. So evidently, again, here's our logical conclusion, our inference, God had told them what God wanted. This is what I want if you want to be acceptable to me. Did you ever notice when you read that passage, though, that then it kind of glosses over that sin? I shouldn't say it that way, but it does to me, because the immediate thing goes somewhere else. It isn't, hey, you need to be acceptable for that sacrifice. God instead says, you got a bigger problem. Your bigger problem is this. How are you going to respond to the shame? Because there is shame involved. When he betrayed God, reading those passages, Cain has lost his honor he would have in connection with him. When you lose the honor that has been given you, what's the first feeling you probably will have? Pain and resentment. Instead, Cain is regarded himself as what? Shameful and disgraced. Read how Cain describes himself in those passages. It's sad in one way. And that's why God makes this commitment and talks about it. Shame is the feeling which comes from being considered unworthy of acceptance. Shame is the feeling of becoming that comes from being considered if you think that you are unworthy, you feel a sense of shame. Shame can begin from an outside action, such as God's rejection of Cain's sacrifice, or from emotions within. Do you know people that have messed themselves up internally so much that the shame that they feel for themselves is such that you can talk to them till you're blue in the face, and you probably have, and it's like it doesn't ever reach them because they're so caught up and so enmeshed in this, I'm not worthy. Shame is not always harmful. This is important to know. Our morality requires us to have a sense of shame. I have met some children who have no shame. I know it's a term that sometimes you use. I have met some that have no shame. Those of you that are in law enforcement, you have met people who have no shame. They are dangerous. They're dangerous to you and your loved ones because there's no limitation to their actions. That's what's sitting at Cain's doorstep. Cain's shame could have led to feelings of regret and a desire to reconnect with God on his terms. Think about where that's happened. Can you think of David, for example? A perfect example. David's shame leads him to feelings of regret. This is kind of what David, you were saying there. And a desire to reconnect on God's terms. But what's the other thing? The other thing is shame would then, well, if you did that, shame would then have been erased when he's accepted. When considered a valued part of the community, shame would be replaced with honor. That's a fancy way, and it sounds more of a community, I apologize for that, than it does a church thing. But think about people who have done things that are wrong. They come back, and what's the first thing you want to do with them when they have repented of that? You want to have them feel like they're back and they're part of the group. That shame is being replaced with what? The honor that they deserve as being one of God's children. See, I'm saying the same thing that we do. I'm just saying in a little bit different terms, probably. And I'm not trying to make it hard, but to me this becomes a lot clearer because this, I think, is more easily understood by those who have never been religious. Because at some level, they understand honor, shame. They act it out. They may not know the terms. Instead, Cain's guilt gives way to anger and jealousy, believing that the events were an effort to steal away his glory and value as a person. I may be reading more in that than's there, but that's how I take his actions. He's feeling that what they've done is they've robbed me of what's mine. I deserve this. You should not take this from me. He began to believe that he had the power to restore it. That's when God spoke to him about the choices a human would and will face. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Where do you rule at? With your hands or your mind? Sin begins in the mind. Sorry about that. You've done that before, haven't you? Hit the thing. His anger was directed at God, and the people who acted as God had instructed them. Haven't we all lived to that? People are disliking us because they didn't get their way. Whatever it happens to be, particularly schools. He imagined that Abel had received the honor that rightly belonged to him. Who's the oldest son here? Cain or Abel? It's Cain. He believed he could restore that respect. This is my commentary light here. I think he believed he could restore that respect to himself through the death of his brother. Otherwise, why kill him? Why'd you kill your brother? Because he had everything. Mom and Dad loved him more. Why'd you kill your sister? Because she was the favorite and she was going to inherit. Is it all just the goods or is it the honor involved? Sin led to him feeling ashamed. His shame then led him to more sin. See how it builds on itself? Using God's gift of free will, he lies to God about his involvement in his brother's death. He follows the earlier example of his father and mother, doesn't he? Who lies. They trust in themselves as capable of making decisions as equally wise as God's. No, God, God made clear to Cain that his choices had consequences. So when sin away, Cain realized, this is kind of talking about death and fear. You start getting to that edge. With fear that he could not control his own future. Did he feel like he could beforehand? It seemed that way. He was going to be in control. Now he realizes that others would now seek to kill him. Cain was somehow, though, protected from the revenge he feared through God's mercy. Another example of God's mercy. Cain has just lied to the God of the universe. And he allows him to live. And not only live, he keeps others from killing him. He gets to continue an earthly existence. He gets to marry and have children. He also has an opportunity for repentance. Why do we say that? Because what does it say about God and time? He's allowing people to have time to do what? Repent. That's why this world is still here. In return, Cain works to replace God's values of honor and shame with his own version. Cain is not a nice person. I don't know how we think about Cain at the end of this, if we have any kind of feeling about him, but at the end, when given an opportunity of repentance, what does Cain do? Cain turns on God and goes his own way. Sin encourages us to believe we can successfully create our own values. Sin distorts pride into a twisted image also, another definition. When sin snapped the bond that connected the Creator and His creation, the honor and glory that man had received from his part of the relationship disappeared. That loss left an emptiness. Man's solution for filling that void emphasized only his abilities. No longer would glory be given to God for creating man and giving him the ability to use the gifts given, Now man would be both creator and creation, or creation and creator in this new honor system. Beginning in Genesis 4. The civilization which develops is a product of human creativity. Man devised the various inventions needed for us to be able to live together. It's usually a chapter we skip over, kind of, this part of chapter 4, isn't it? It's a list of names and inventions. Ada and Zillah, the first women to be mentioned after Eve, became the original mothers of invention. Went right over everyone's head in here. Okay. Zillah's daughter is beautiful, the meaning of Nama, and their sons are successful. What do we have here? We have the beginning of modern man. This is culture. This is the definition of success, beauty and money, or goods. Their sons are successful, contributing to the arts, Jubal. Industry, manufacturing, Tubal. Animal husbandry, Jabal. Being a natural offspring of mother and father is emphasized in these passages. When you read them, it tells you the name of the dad and the mom, and they're both human. It's not like Cain. It's not like Adam and Eve, rather. And in this entire section, God is not mentioned. So in filling this emptiness, a weakness evolves that couldn't be fixed. And here's the weakness. Each person is going to decide how and when to enforce their own version of honor. This is what happens during this time. For example, in Genesis 4 and verse 23, Lamech tells his multiple wives. Yeah, now he has multiple wives. Hey, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. I don't know if that's two different people or one going into detail, and it really doesn't matter. Why did he kill him? Because that person struck me. Lamech had decided upon his own definition of honor and dishonor. Having the physical power to do it, he also enforced it. In the book of Judges, how is this phrased? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Each person becomes the decision maker of what's right and wrong. This is what's happening in the world. This is how Paul put it in Romans, the first chapter. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And what is the creature? The creature is man himself. It's ourselves. That's who we start worshiping. During this time, what I find interesting is God continued to protect those who sought after him. In 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, in verse 20, Peter described God as waiting while Noah completed his ark until that moment when he would save Noah and his family through water. The floodwaters rose to protect Noah from what? From a group that had given up on God. Was Noah saved from the flood or by the flood? By the flood. Then what was Noah in danger of? The world around him. Noah, his immediate family, all his descendants continued to have the ability to say no to God. And when they did, they relied upon their own abilities and slipped into lives centered around physical pleasure and violence. How long did it take? Well, we don't know for sure, but it wasn't long before things happened with Noah and his family.
It does say in the scriptures there that right after Seth was born, whoever his son was, it's right along in there, it said, at this time men began to call on the name of
if you could hear what Dave was saying, he was talking about there are some, and that's why I was mentioning that God continues to protect. There are some that are there. Now, we have a pretty good understanding. I look around, and we have a pretty good understanding that when we talk about in the Old Testament, and we say that people are sinful people, that they do follow God, and that there's a promise God has made to them, that there will be a way towards salvation for them. But when you think about it, without Jesus, that way doesn't exist, and it didn't exist. There was a promise, and a promise only. So when we see that, in Genesis 11, a group begins building the tallest tower possible. They boasted it would make them unforgettable and show everyone their limitless ability. This is not them trying to reach heaven. That's the phrase, but what are they actually trying to do? Yeah, reaching God is not their goal. Instead, their interest lay in praising themselves and getting others to be impressed with them. Instead of God being their focus, they formed themselves into their God and desired the world to worship and honor them. The fact that nothing they proposed to do would be impossible for them proves their motives. God protects His people. How did He protect them at this time? Creation of different languages, spread of people around the globe. And really, as we finish this here, I wanted to look at this last little section just very quickly. Man is given the right of free will. He could disobey and go his own way, but God would continue to protect His own. Sin is like a cancer, which grows, twists, distorts, and kills. Sin is going beyond God's law. Sin is willingly betraying God. Sin twists shame for its own purpose. Sin distorts pride into a twisted image. Not negative. This is hope. This is hope. You become what you worship. We almost always use that in a negative way, don't we? When's the last time we've used it in a positive way? Why are we worshiping? We become what we worship. You become what you set your eyes upon. You become that to which you give yourself. We have a choice between which one? Between sin and following God. And the promise that God has made, His mercy continues to protect those who sought after Him, even though they had also sinned. And I woke up the baby, so it's time to stop. Thank you. Now this time, next week will be Kevin. Thank you so much.